Yo, what is going on, Headliner Nation? With the news that we're going to have some changes at the quarterback position heading into week 6, it's really important that we dive deep and try to find some wide receivers this week that can help us through injuries, buys, ineffective play, whatever it may end up being. And that's why we are going through every single matchup of the NFL slate for week 6 to try and determine which wide receivers we definitely have to start, which wide receivers should be in our lineup but maybe pose a risk, and maybe a few guys that we should just not even be considering for a spot. But before we hop into all that, I need to remind everybody that we're doing a huge giveaway right now for anyone that signs up for Underdog during the month of October while using our code Headliners. If you want to be entered for a chance to win a full-size framed autographed Jonathan Taylor jersey, then you need to get in on the action by heading on over to Underdog or downloading their app using code word Headliners to create a new account, deposit at least $10, and then play in your very first game, and you're gonna be all set. On top of that, you're gonna get a deposit bonus of up to $1,000 plus a super special pick'em that's almost guaranteed to hit. Come join us over on Underdog and have some fun playing along with us while also getting the opportunity to win this awesome jersey. San Francisco and Seattle on Thursday Night Football should bring a ton of fun fantasy upside, but it's Thursday Night Football and weird things can happen. I feel like it's the most fantasy football thing to happen, and it would sum up 2024 perfectly that last Thursday night, Atlanta and Tampa Bay absolutely went off. And then on this Thursday night, when we have San Francisco and Seattle playing, things would just be super weird. It's going to be a defensive matchup, and we're not going to see anything fantasy happen. For San Francisco, I think it's fair to say that we can't put Brandon Aiyuk and Deebo Samuel as a low risk unless the matchup absolutely warrants it. And Seattle's defense doesn't look nearly as daunting as it did to begin the season, but Brandon Aiyuk and Devin Witherspoon will likely match up against each other. And we also don't know where the volume may go on any given week. Plus, Jordan Mason should be able to run the football very well this week. If you own Brandon Aiyuk and Deebo Samuel, you're probably not leaving them out of your lineup anyway, but just know with them in there this week, there's definitely a very wide range of outcomes that could happen. And for Jauan Jennings, really for me this week, George Kittle has a better opportunity to be that number 1, 2, or 3 target than Jennings does. For Seattle, DK Metcalf is a low risk. He plays the most snaps out of all the wide receivers. He sees the most targets out of all the wide receivers. But if the dude could stop fumbling, I would really appreciate it because that's now back-to-back weeks with a fumble loss for him. Now, Tyler Lockett and Jackson Smith-Njigba are both fantasy viable, but the problem is they have a much wider range of outcomes than what DK Metcalf does. Seattle's been throwing the ball an awful lot lately, which is great because that type of volume gives Lockett and JSN the fantasy upside that we would need to consider them for our lineups. But if everything holds true and Mike McDonald does go back to the run a little bit more often this week like he discussed after last week's game, maybe that leads to a little bit lower volume. But Geno still has an opportunity to throw the ball 40 times this game, and if he does that, both of these guys should see at least enough volume to be considered for your flex position at the very least. The second London matchup of the year could spell disaster for the Jags as they have an awful matchup going up against the Chicago Bears. And for the wide receivers, Brian Thomas Jr. is the number 1 target in this offense right now. He's got the best big playability, the best touchdown potential. So he's going to be a medium risk start every single week for the most part. I really can't put him as a high risk start when there's a chance that there's going to be negative game script. And even if he doesn't see that big play, he would still lead the team in targets. But the biggest question here for us is probably going to be about Christian Kirk. He had a pretty good day a couple of weeks ago, and then last week he had another okay day, but the problem was it was built off of a 61-yard reception. But the number you may not realize is Christian Kirk played a season-low percentage of snaps in week 5. And not only that, he didn't take 1 snap in 12 personnel, which is when Jacksonville put 2 tight ends on the field. Christian Kirk is really only playing in 3 wide receiver sets right now. And when Evan Ingram comes back, they could pair him and Brenton Strange for a whole lot more 12 personnel, which would leave Christian Kirk off the field a majority of the time. If that ends up happening, he's going to be completely fantasy irrelevant, and he's not even going to be worthy of a roster spot. If you have him, it may be time to try and sell him. If you can't and you're holding on to him, just pray that either he starts to see more time in 2 wide receiver sets or Trevor Lawrence starts to hate Gabe Davis. And on top of all that, the Chicago Bears have only allowed 1 receiving touchdown all season. This is a solid matchup for the Chicago Bears wide receivers though, but the only guy that I feel like is even close to being a safe play is DJ Moore. He's absolutely the wide receiver 1 and will likely see the most targets. It's going to be a toss-up between Keenan Allen and Rome Odunze though, and both of these guys need to see 5 or more targets to be fantasy relevant. Now, if you want to take a shot at the upside, it's Rome Odunze. He has the most touchdown potential. I could see him getting like 4 targets, 3 receptions, 28 to 35 yards and 1 touchdown or something along those lines. Not great, but definitely flex worthy. Keenan Allen to me doesn't have a whole lot of touchdown potential, but he could see 5 or 6 targets and put together about 50 yards. If those 2 numbers were to happen, then yeah, you could potentially play them. But the question is who is the number 2 target after DJ Moore? Because Cole Kmet is looking a whole lot better, and if he's the number 2 target, that's going to leave out one of these wide receivers, especially if they run the ball well. It could be a really fun game watching Marvin Harrison Jr. and Jayden Reed battle back and forth in the Arizona-Green Bay matchup this week. Green Bay's defense is inside the top 10 of most receiving yards, touchdowns, and fantasy points allowed to the wide receiver position. And Marvin Harrison Jr. saw plenty of targets last week. He just really couldn't make much out of them. This week against Green Bay, that could absolutely change. Let's just hope Kyler Murray doesn't turn the ball over. And Marvin Harrison Jr.'s current projection over on Underdog is only 58.5 yards. So every lineup I'm submitting, I need some Marvin Harrison Jr. as a part of it. Going up against this defense, and with the amount of targets that he saw last week, I can't see that bad luck happening for a second straight game. He should be in for a big day. And Michael Wilson also may end up having a little bit of solid fantasy value this week. His floor is definitely a lot lower than what we would like, but in a potential back and forth matchup, he absolutely could be utilized. Jayden Reed is absolutely the number 1 wide receiver for the Green Bay Packers, and he's entered must-start territory with Jordan Love. That connection is way too strong, and he has put up way too good of numbers with him to not be considered every single week for a top spot in your lineup. Now, I know we loved Dontavian Wicks last week, and it just didn't end up working out. It was bad luck. He led the team in targets, he played over 70% of the snaps, and he was absolutely utilized as a wide receiver too. Now this week, I'm not nearly as high on him because of the fact that Romeo Doubs is returning. And what is that going to look like? Is Doubs going to be back on the field and everything's going to be back to normal? Is Tucker Kraft going to be looked at a lot more consistently now? It could end up being Jayden Reed, then Tucker Kraft, and then after that, who knows in any given week. That's where things would get really interesting with any of the wide receivers outside of Jayden Reed. It's really hard to make any definitive calls about the Indianapolis Colts wide receivers this early in the week. Shane Steichen made it clear when Anthony Richardson is healthy, he is going to start. Joe Flacco will go back to the bench. But we don't know if Anthony Richardson is healthy yet. And that is absolutely going to change the projection for these Indianapolis wide receivers this week, especially going up against a defense like Tennessee. Tennessee is currently allowing the fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position and haven't allowed a receiving touchdown all season as of yet. If Joe Flacco starts, it gives these guys a way better floor. But if Anthony Richardson starts, all of these guys are going to be high risk, and I don't know if it's worthy of playing any of them this week. Make sure you tune back in later in the week for our rankings and our live shows so we can dive into it a little bit more when we know who the quarterback will be. Hopefully Tennessee utilized their bye week well and got Will Levis ready to go for this matchup against Indianapolis. As long as he doesn't make too many mistakes, DeAndre Hopkins should have a really safe floor and plenty of targets this week. And even though Calvin Ridley is a high-risk play for me, he has a lot of upside in this matchup as well. He could get like 2 targets, catch both of them for like 20 yards, and be absolutely a dumpster fire. Or he could get like 6 targets this week. He could catch 4 of them for 80 to 100 yards and a touchdown. If you need a high upside play, Calvin Ridley isn't the worst bet you could make. Just know it's one of the riskiest bets you could make. It appears Houston is going to be without Nico Collins for a while, so it may be time for Tank Dell to finally have his 2024 breakout. Now, last week after Nico Collins went out, Tank Dell only saw 5 targets, and I would love to see more targets for him this week. To me personally, Stefon Diggs is still a safer bet. Yes, Christian Gonzalez will be on him at times, which will be a tough matchup, but they're still going to move him around the formation and they're going to get him away from Gonzalez on a consistent basis. So I don't expect him to be locked up the entire matchup. He's the safest floor. The highest upside is definitely Tank Dell this week. Although we haven't seen much out of him as of late, and only having 5 targets after Collins left last week is not a great sign. Dalton Schultz is vying for that number 2 target spot right now. Tank Dell needs to step up, needs to have a big week, and hopefully CJ Stroud is looking his way quite a bit. This would definitely be a week to take a risk with Tank Dell. It could end up being really good news that Drake May is now the starter in New England. It was just announced yesterday that he would be taking over moving forward, and that could be great for the upside of the wide receivers, something that hasn't happened yet with them in 2024. But I really don't know who to bank on as of yet. Demario Douglas seems like the best bet. He was kind of the guy getting the most consistent targets. But the difference between Jacoby Brissett and Drake May change with the wide receivers, and we may see a guy like Jalen Polk step up. We're not 100% sure as of yet, so all of these guys are going to be a high risk with Drake May, especially going up against the Houston defense that basically shut down Josh Allen in their passing game last week. I feel like we need to take a week. Unless you're desperate for a play and you go with Demario Douglas, I would rather wait a week, see who Drake May likes the most, and then we'll reevaluate prior to week 7. Before I start talking about the Tampa Bay-New Orleans matchup, let me just say real quick that my thoughts are with everybody down in Florida, especially in the Tampa Bay area and along the coastline there. When this video posts, Hurricane Milton will not have made landfall as of yet, but it will have a few short hours after this video comes out. So my thoughts are with everybody down in Florida. Please stay safe. And if you have the ability after the hurricane is hit and cleanup efforts have begun, try to do whatever you can to assist with the people down there. From a football standpoint, Tampa Bay is going to have a football game to play. They head up to New Orleans to take on the Saints. And Chris Godwin, he's going to be a low-risk play for me this week. The Saints currently allow the 7th most receiving yards, essentially because they've played in a positive game script an awful lot this season. But they've only allowed 1 receiving touchdown, which leads me to believe that Mike Evans is going to have a little bit more of a riskier stat line this week than what Chris Godwin will. We know Mike Evans can be hit or miss against New Orleans, figuratively and literally. Those two teams always seem to have a little bit of a scrum whenever they get together. Mike Evans has touchdown potential this week. It's just a lot riskier than what we've seen at times from him this week, where Chris Godwin is a lot safer because I definitely see him having more targets. Derek Carr is dealing with an oblique injury, and there are some reports that the rookie Spencer Rattler will end up being the starter this week. If that happens, or it's Jake Haener, it really doesn't matter to me. There becomes a very high risk with both of these wide receivers. Now, Chris Olave is still a guy that we may have to consider playing depending on what we have. But if you have Rashid Shaheed, I'm almost willing to sit him no matter what. Derek Carr can definitely go deep, but I don't know if either of these guys are going to be able to take the shot that we need for Rashid Shaheed to have the upside and potential that needs to be in our fantasy lineup. Be very cautious with this matchup and continue to check in on who the quarterback may be throughout the week. The Cleveland Browns offense is like gas station sushi. You look at it, it looks good, and in that moment, you have a little bit of a weakness where you're like, I'm going to give this a shot. I think it's definitely going to work out. And then a day or two later, you realize really quickly, I should have never trusted that. I mean, this is a great matchup against Philadelphia, but Deshaun Watson can't even throw for 200 yards. So what's the ceiling for Amari Cooper really like? These guys have a whole lot of risk every single week. We know Amari Cooper can have a big week. He's shown it with Deshaun Watson before, and that's why he's going to be a medium risk. He saw 10 targets last week, 7 more than the next closest player on the team. He's clearly the wide receiver 1. But Deshaun Watson, he could end up sucking. Amari Cooper could end up sucking. And then we regret putting him in our lineup a couple of days later, even though in the moment it looked like a really good idea. DeVonta Smith and A.J. Brown, both expected to play, both expected to be fine, are still going to be a medium risk for me though, just because they are both coming back from injury. If they both end up playing, they're both in your lineup regardless, so don't even worry about looking at that medium risk and thinking, should I keep them out? No. Cleveland definitely isn't the most ideal matchup in the world for them, but at this point in time, we don't have a whole lot of options that have more upside than what Smith or A.J. Brown do, so we're going to end up playing both of them anyway. A.J. Brown, just like normal when both of these guys are healthy, has an opportunity to be the wide receiver 1. DeVonta Smith would be a little bit more dependent on the big play and the touchdown. Get ready for what I hope is one of the biggest offensive matchups of the entire weekend, with Washington and Baltimore going up against each other. Jayden Daniels versus Lamar Jackson. And also Terry McLaurin versus Zay Flowers. I'm really excited for what both of these wide receivers could end up doing. And honestly, they're the only two wide receivers that I'm even interested in this matchup, and both of them have a good matchup to go with it. Terry McLaurin has either a touchdown or at least 100 receiving yards in each of his last 3 games. And over the course of the last 3 games, he's the wide receiver 11. And then for Zay Flowers, in games in which his team has not led by double-digit points, he has 10, 11, and 12 targets. Both of these guys have a chance for great volume, for big plays, for touchdowns, and absolute fantasy dominance. And right now, Terry McLaurin is projected for 57.5 yards over on Underdog. He's absolutely going in my Underdog lineups this week, and I am going higher on that receiving total. And if you want to get a little spicy with a 1.48 multiplier, go ahead and take him for a touchdown if you want. And the same thing for Zay Flowers. His projection over on Underdog is 56.5 receiving yards. I'm absolutely going higher than that with him in my lineup. Now, his multiplier for a touchdown isn't as high, but at 1.21, I could take that as well. From one of my favorite wide receiver matchups to the week to quite possibly the worst wide receiver matchup of the week. The Chargers are facing a Denver secondary that has allowed the 4th fewest receiving yards, 2nd fewest fantasy points, and only 1 touchdown to wide receivers so far this year. And the Chargers defense is currently allowing the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to the wide receiver position and 2nd fewest receiving yards to wide receivers. However, part of that is because they did have the bye last week. However, if they did play last week, they could have allowed just over 200 yards to the wide receivers and still been inside the top 12 fewest yards allowed. I'm just not seeing a need to risk it with any of these wide receivers. We haven't seen consistent fantasy output from any of them this season, and I don't think any of us are in a position where we have to rely on one of these guys. If you are, it may be better to take a quick peek at your waiver wire and see if anybody else out there may be able to give you a little bit of a higher ceiling and potentially roll with them instead. Okay, there's going to be a lot of questions this week about George Pickens. So for Pittsburgh, let's focus in on him because he's really been the only fantasy relevant wide receiver that we've been looking at consistently. Now, last week, for whatever reason, he only played 1 snap in 2 wide receiver sets. And he saw 10 to 15 snaps fewer than what Calvin Austin and Van Jefferson did. Mike Tomlin was asked, why was George Pickens left off the field so often? And essentially he said, we wanted more quality snaps, not more quantity of snaps, which makes absolutely no sense. If George Pickens is your #1 wide receiver, why are you taking him off the field? Is he in trouble? Is this really the case? And if it is, who's behind it? Is it Arthur Smith? That's stupid. Is it Mike Tomlin? It's still stupid, but at least he might have a better reason why. So because of that, it's hard to trust George Pickens this week. If you need to put him in your lineup, he definitely has a wide variance. He's still the #1 wide receiver on this team. This is still a pretty decent matchup for him, but we don't know what his upside is if he's being left off the field that often once again. Now, with all of that being said, that doesn't make Calvin Austin or Van Jefferson fantasy relevant. For Las Vegas, I truly believe we've seen Davante Adams play his last snap in a Raiders jersey. He's either not coming back from injury or he's going to be traded before he does. I don't think that he's going to play another snap with Las Vegas. So until he lands somewhere else, he's going to be a high risk. Now, that does leave a really good opportunity for Jakobi Meyers, but he's really the only one that I'm consistently looking at right now. Trey Tucker is more of a deep fantasy flex for me. Now, I would take him over any of the Denver or Chargers wide receivers, but he's not going to be a guy that I'm consistently going to tell you to start as of right now. Who knows what's happening with Gardner Minshew? He's been pulled from 2 games over the first 5 weeks of the season due to interceptions. Will Aiden O'Connell end up getting more starts moving forward? I'm not really sure, and changing quarterbacks in the middle of the game isn't best for anybody involved either. I have a hard time believing that this game between Dallas and Detroit is not going to be an offensive slugfest. Detroit is going to want vengeance for that loss that they had to the Cowboys last season. And we all know Dallas is going to bring it at home and try to tear apart that Lions secondary. For the Lions, Amon-Ra St. Brown will be a low-risk candidate this week. He's going to lead the team in targets. He's going to have a solid day in terms of yards, and he has touchdown potential as well. Really, really good floor and still a really nice ceiling. Jameson Williams, a little bit more dependent on the big play. He's going to need that big play and a touchdown to really be able to get into that fantasy viable area. But we know it only takes one play with him. But part of the question is going to be the health of the Dallas Cowboys defense. DeMarcus Lawrence, we already know that he's missing. Micah Parsons, as of Monday, was still nursing an ankle injury and was not expected to play this week unless something were to change over the course of the week. So if there's no Micah Parsons this week, it gives Jared Goff more time in the pocket and Jameson Williams more opportunity to break those big plays. We know CeeDee Lamb has a great opportunity to smash in this matchup. He did last season, and even with an improved secondary, he could still do it again this year with them being so young. CeeDee Lamb is going to be one of the top wide receivers in all of football this week and absolutely should be in your lineup as one of your top options. Now, Jalen Tolbert is the number 2 now that Brandon Cooks is on IR, definitely gives you some solid floor this week. He led the team in targets with 10 last week, and if he can get close to that number again, he should definitely give you the fantasy numbers needed to at least be considered for a flex spot. Drake London and Darnell Mooney are absolute smash starts this week. Both of them have tremendous floors. It's the ceiling that may be a little bit of an issue, and that's because either A, Atlanta's going to run the ball so well they won't have to throw it as much, or B, they're going to be leading by so much they're not going to have to throw it as much. Both of those things would be a disaster for their ceiling, but both of them should still give you really solid floors. Now, as of this recording, Xavier Legette is banged up, and it is reported that he will probably play this week, but nothing has been confirmed as of yet. Deontay Johnson should end up being a guy that we're taking a look at this week. Even though the matchup isn't great for him, it's a lot better than it was last week, and he should get back to some of that ceiling that we've seen with Andy Dalton so far. Ja'Marr Chase right now has top 3 potential regardless of the matchup. Joe Burrow is playing fantastic, and so is Chase. He's absolutely in our lineup, and if you have him, you're already off to a good start this week. T. Higgins, I know we'll get some questions about him. We have every week since he's returned. He's a start for me this week. He brings a little bit more risk because Ja'Marr Chase is the guy, and any type of positive game script could lead to running the ball a little bit more. But in this instance, T. Higgins should still see a safe amount of volume, and he has touchdown potential to go with it. Let's just hope he doesn't disappear in this game. Now, the reason Cincinnati can't get a win is because their defense can't figure it out and get a stop. Wan'Dale Robinson and Malik Nabers, who should be back from his concussion this week, are both starts for me and both have great potential in this matchup. Malik Nabers has top 5 potential. Wan'Dale Robinson is definitely a solid top 24 candidate, and for some reason, if he were to score a touchdown, he's going to get close to the top 12 just based on volume alone. We have some fantastic offensive matchups this week. Monday Night Football may not follow that same script, however. For Monday Night Football, Buffalo and the New York Jets could bring a defensive matchup that could leave fantasy owners a little bit underwhelmed with the output of their players. Now at the wide receiver position, we're going to be keeping an eye on Khalil Shakir and whether or not he can make it back from injury this week. If he does, he's going to be a guy that brings medium risk, but should end up being the most targeted player and is going to be staying away from the outside and Sauce Gardner, which makes him a decent fantasy option. But for me, Keon Coleman is going to be my Mando must-avoid of the week. And if you need to avoid odor the same way I'm avoiding Keon Coleman this week, all you got to do is head on over to Shop Mando, and right now, using code word headliners, you can get $5 off their starter pack, which essentially is 40% off the price. And I absolutely love Mando and their clinically proven formula that helps to defeat odors for up to 72 hours. And when you're super busy like I am, you need all the odor protection that you can get, especially when I have to play guys like Keon Coleman in my lineup. Coleman had 5 targets last week, but he only caught 1 of them, and that happened to turn into a 49-yard touchdown. But it wasn't because of anything Coleman did, it was because Houston forgot how to play defense and couldn't tackle. In the 3 games prior to week 5, he only saw 6 total targets, and now he's gonna get Sauce Gardner on the outside more than likely. Yeah, and that's a no from me, dog. I don't have any interest in Keon Coleman in this matchup. The Buffalo Bills are allowing the 3rd fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers right now. Now, Garrett Wilson is coming off of a huge target share last week, and we really have to hope that continues for his fantasy value. Allen Lazard will continue to be a little bit more touchdown dependent, and this week doesn't have a great ceiling because finding the end zone could be a little bit more difficult. Even though Robert Saleh's been fired, I don't see a huge change up with the philosophy for the offense because Nathaniel Hackett is still leading it on that side of the ball. So I would probably recommend trying to pivot off Allen Lazard this week. If you got Garrett Wilson, we will run him out there and just hope the target share ends up being the same. There you have it, Headliner Nation, breaking down every single matchup for week 6 for the wide receiver position. And don't forget our big giveaway in October right now. Getting signed up over on Underdog puts you in for a drawing to win an autographed framed Jonathan Taylor jersey. But I need to go talk about quarterbacks now. Peace out, Headliner Nation. Stay safe and healthy, and I'll catch you all in the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.